Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Elena Scherer. I'm a transport policy advisor at GIZ, and I want to welcome you to the sixth episode of our joint webinar series of the UNFCCC Secretariat and GIZ on methodologies for greenhouse gas baselines and monitoring in the transport sector. Today's topic is the MRV of measures of shift mode of freight transport from road to rail or water. Next slide, please. It is the 6th of 8 webinars based on the 8 chapters of the UNFCCC Secretariat's passenger and freight transport volume that some of you might already know. Yeah, it's a second updated version published earlier this year. The transport volume was coordinated by the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ, in cooperation with the UNFCCC Secretariat and the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transports LOCAT. It was funded through the International Climate Initiative of the German Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, PMU. It was written with the assistance of the Center for Clean Air Policy, CCAP, with contributions from the International Council on Clean Transportation and INFRAS. It covers more than 30 methodologies and tools, which are structured into the 8 different mitigation action types that you can see on this slide. So next slide, please. This session will be recorded as all the others have been, and we will share the link with you in the follow-up email in the next days. And the past recordings you can find on our website changingtransport.org, where you also find other interesting publications on MRV and other transport and climate related topics. So I invite you to pass by on our website. You can also download the transport volume during the webinar in the handout section that you find in your panel. So let me just shortly present you the agenda and the speakers. So first, Mr. Fernandez of the CGE will give us a short introduction. He is project manager in climate change mitigation with a background in economics and statistics and works at the European Environment Agency, EEA. He is a member of the UNFCCC Consultative Group of Experts, and his main responsibilities at the EEA are the coordination of the European GHG inventory to the UNFCCC and the analysis of GHG emission trends and drivers. Then I will continue to give a short introduction on the 6th chapter of the transport volume and share the most important content with you. Then our last input will be by Mr. Hedge and Mr. Cardoso, and we'll focus on the application of CDM methodologies in a practical example. Mr. Cardoso is a chemical engineer and has been working with the UNFCCC Secretariat since 2009. Prior to that, he has worked for the CDM project activities in Latin America by supporting the project owners throughout the whole CDM project cycle. Mr. Hedge leads the regulatory development team to develop standards to ensure the outcomes of climate actions within the Sustainable Development Mechanism program of the UNFCCC Secretariat in Bonn. And over the last 12 years, he has contributed to the development of over 100 methodologies and standardized baselines under the CDM, including also the area of transportation. And after our inputs, you will get the chance to share your questions, as I said before, in the Q&A session, which is moderated by Mr. Pillay, who is Program Officer at UNFCCC and joined the Climate Change Secretariat in 2010. He has worked in the areas of accreditation of operating entities under the CDM and joint implementation, as well as conducting CDM assessments of CDM projects. So now I would like to hand over to the next speaker, Mr. Fernandez. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and welcome to all the participants. I will give you a short overview of the objectives of the webinar.
First, the content overview of the sixth chapter. So each of the chapters is structured in the same way, with starting with a description of the characteristics and the structure of mitigation effects, then how to determine the baseline calculation and the emission reductions. Yeah, but I will go through that now step by step by showing the most important figures of each paragraph. So I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, that's the core of the chapter, the cause impact chain. So you see some potential actions to shift the transport cargo from trucks to other modes, for example, by building new railway lines. So this leads to a higher modal share of railway transport and a lower share of freight transport on the road. So you can see here what indicators can be then used to monitor the effects of the policies. So in this case, it would be the ton kilometer per mode. And in parallel to shift measures, as I said before, you can also target the efficiency of the vehicles, leading to other emission factors, but with the same overall target to reduce fuel and GHG emissions. So in this figure, unintended side effects are also shown with that lighter orange color. And due to the higher capacity and lower costs, as rebound effect, freight volume might even increase. After you have implemented your policies that decreases costs in the freight sector. So that can be a risk for the mitigation success. So when you're measuring the effects of your policy or action, this means you have to be also aware of the unintended effects and integrate them into your project monitoring. So the baseline emissions from the transportation of the cargo are calculated based on the amount of cargo transported, the distance of the baseline trip between origin and destination from transportation of cargo by trucks, and the baseline emission factor per ton kilometers of cargo transported. And the measurement of current freight movement data serves as the basis for the baseline calculation, which must be then projected into the future for ex ante analysis and counterfactually projected for ex post analysis. The mitigation scenario of freight activity in ton kilometer is typically assumed to be the same amount as the baseline, but then shifted to more efficient modes. Positive side effects of the policies could be the decreased congestion and noise due to fewer trucks on the road, and also increased road safety. The boundary setting will depend on the type of mitigation action that you choose to implement. So water or rail are usually best for long distance freight transport. Thus, the project will be best analyzed at the national or regional level. Often a specific corridor, such as a river, is singled out for investment, which can be used as a boundary while considering the feeder routes leading to it. The measures will have their effect on a long term, so the temporal dimension will be at least 10 to 20 years. For the boundary setting, the upstream emissions from electricity generation should be also included if a rail is powered by electricity. However, if the mitigation action of the project only aims at the switch to electric energy, then the analyzer should consider methodologies under fuel switching, which is action type number 4 and can be found in the other chapter of the compendium. And as large projects such as port or new railway lines may have substantial construction emissions, those should be also considered as part of the life cycle emissions and taken into consideration in your calculations. In this case, it may be necessary to compare with baseline construction emissions if the BAU scenario also consists the construction of new highways or similar investments. So next slide, please. So the baseline scenario, as I said, is that the freight is transported by trucks or on roads. And there are 4 general approaches for baselines or mode shift scenarios, as you can see on this slide. So there are the national or regional freight models, growth factor methods, expert judgment-based methods on historical trends, and based on survey or data collection from shippers, including state preference surveys. And it depends a lot on the data availability, which of this approaches you would use. Having statistical data, of course, improves the reliability of your calculation, but the reality in many of our partner countries is that the access to data is a huge challenge, even more if the private sector is included. So in some cases, you might rely a lot on expert judgments. So here you can see some of the methodologies that you find in the compendium. On the top, you find the ex-ante methodologies that can be used for policy planning. And on the bottom, the ex-post methodologies that can be used for monitoring and reporting under CDM. And as you see, they are differentiated into different degrees of accuracy, depending on the data that is available. So the higher the accuracy, the more disaggregated locally derived data you will need. So in addition to this map, the volume also has a tabular guide and descriptions for each methodology, which you will see in the next slides. I will not go into detail for all of these methodologies, but we will have the presentation of the CDM example then next. So I just want to mention that there are a few, and you can discover all of them in the compendium. So if you're planning to implement or monitor a new policy on freight shift mode, please consult the compendium or any of us for more details. With regard to the monitoring, you can see that there is some general guidance on monitoring in the compendium, and that we differentiate between 3 types of indicators: the implementation indicators, the performance indicators, and the impact indicators. So the implementation indicators would include emissions caused by the new infrastructure. So that will be measured only once, or if there are several construction phases, you can do that by each construction phase. Then we have the performance indicators, such as mode shift in percent, that will have to, or that are recommended to be monitored annually. And lastly, the impact indicators, such as the calculated cargo ton kilometers per mode, that can be monitored around every 5 years. So the monitoring frequency will vary depending on the monitoring regime, and also, of course, the budget available for data collection, because this requires a lot of data collection. And as freight movement is generally done by private companies, you have to gather that data or request their data for monitoring purposes. And incentives for carriers to report data should therefore be considered. Thank you for your attention, and I would like to hand over now to our next speakers that present the two CDM methodologies in more detail.
Okay, so thank you, Elena, for that overview of the chapter 6 of the compendium. And now we will move on to the CDM methodologies that can be applied. And this will be done by both Mr. Hegder and Mr. Eduardo Filho. So I now give the presentation over to them to give you that overview.
Thanks, Marlon. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Eduardo Cardoso here speaking. Before starting with the review of the methodologies, I'd just like to give you two snapshots on the CDM in the transport sector among large-scale methodologies, small-scale methodologies, and methodologicals too. The CDM Executive Board has to date published more than 200 standards, being 20 of these standards on the transport sector, split between modal shifting passenger transportation, freight transportation, energy efficiency measures, production of biodiesel, fuel switching, aviation, and 3 methodological tools, 1 to determine emissions from transportation of freight, and 2 regarding the modal shifts, 1 on the cargo transport and the other on the passenger transport. Still in the CDM, out of 8,000 projects registered to date by the CDM Executive Board, 30 projects involve the transport sector, being most of them 20 in the modal shifts in passenger transport, such as BRTs, MRTS, and cable cars, and to date only 1 involving the modal shift in freight transport, and 1 other CPA also in the freight transport from a registered POA. And both these project and CPA involved the modal shift from road to rail. Now, going on the 2 approved methodologies on the transport sector that are available in the Compendium of Compendium of Methodologies, CDMEB has approved AM 90, which is the modal shift in transportation of cargo from road to water or rail, and AM 110, which is the modal shift transportation of liquid fuels to newly constructed pipelines. And as I explained, you can realize that the structure of the methodologies is very similar. The typical projects involve the transportation for AM 19 using barges, ships or trains, and for AM 110, transportation of cargo using newly constructed pipeline, where the baseline scenario for these 2 methodologies is that the cargo would be transported using trucks. And for those not familiar with the CDM procedures, the baseline scenario is identified applying an analysis of barriers and a financial analysis among several options on the hands of the developer of the project. And by conducting this analysis, he has to reach the conclusion that the baseline scenario would be the transportation of the cargo by road. And of course, the project scenario involves for AM 90 the transportation of the cargo by train or ships, and for AM 110 the transportation by newly constructed pipelines. And these 2 methodologies each has relevant applicability conditions. I just highlighted here 2, that the baseline and projects, that in the baseline and the project only 1 type of cargo is transported and no mix is allowed, and also issues related to the distance of the baseline trip road, that they shall be identified at the development of the project and they shall not change during the project lifetime. On the calculation, the baseline emissions, they will be updated every year after the project is implemented by monitoring the distance traveled, the amount of cargo transported, the distance traveled set when the project was developed. And the heart of these 2 methodologies is the baseline emission factor, which is an emission factor by ton-kilometer of cargo transported that can be determined using historical data on fuel consumed, cargo transported, distance of baseline trip, or conservative default emission factors for different types of cargo transported. For AM 110, since it's only about liquid fuels, a default emission factor of 76 grams of CO2 per ton kilometer can be used. projects. And the project emissions are accounted based on the regular operation of the project, meaning the electricity consumed, the fossil fuel consumed, and the associated emission factors from the energy carrier considered. And the monitor parameters would be to calculate the project emissions, the amount of fuel and electricity consumed, the emission factor, net calorific value when relevant, and the amount of cargo transported by the project transportation mode. We also have the 217, which is a methodological tool developed to calculate the baseline emissions for mode of shift of cargo measures in interurban cargo transport. It is applicable to calculate the baseline and baseline emission factor from projects implementing mode of shift in the transportation of cargo, and it contains a stepwise approach to determine the baseline emissions, involving identify the relevant cargo types. The tool contains one table with one proposal list of cargo types to be considered, determine the mode share of each of these cargo that are traveling in the country in the baseline or in the geographical scope in the baseline, and determine the average emission factor per ton kilometer of the cargo in question transported by the different modes of transportation involving rail, water, pipeline, or road. And here is also realized the spirit of the tool, which is to calculate an weighted average emission factor of the cargo transported based on the different modes of transport. And this weighted average emission factor could be a standardized baseline for one type of cargo for the country or for the region. Now, before finalizing, I'd like to show you two examples of the projects and the component of the programming of activities that have been registered, but unfortunately no issuance has taken place so far. The first project is developed in Chile, Apply M90, and involves the construction of a new rail system to transport cement and cement aggregates from the factory to the shipment, and it replaces the transportation in the baseline using trucks. The amount of emission reductions is quite small, is around 5,600 per year, and here you can see some figures of the projects. It involves mainly implementation of deviation of the main railways from the loading and unloading points, the replacement of the wagons, and improvements to optimize the loading and unloading of the cargo. And for the specific projects, the baseline emission factor was taken as a default value from a table containing the methodology. And the other project is one project in India. It involves an old version of the methodology 3C, the small scale methodology 3C, and involves the transportation, the shift of transportation of newly produced cars from truck to road between the factory in Manesar and Mundra, where the ship is located. For the baseline, the specific fuel consumption of the trailers was 0.36 kilos of diesel per kilometer. And in the project scenarios, you can see that the specific fuel consumption is significantly lower, about 0.003543. And the origin and destination are around the same. Now, if you would like to know more about the CDM methodologies, you can access these two websites I'm leaving here, one for large-scale methodologies and the other for small-scale methodologies. To find the methodologies related to transport, you have to click on this show search form first, and then on the drop list menu, you select transport and click the button search. And then the list of the methodologies you can see here on the screen will be displayed to you. Okay, that's all from our side. Thanks very much.
So thank you, Eduardo, for providing this overview of the CDM methodologies and tools that are available for this transport sector, specific to this topic on the modal shift. And now we have not received any questions. So if you would like to send in any question, please do so now. Otherwise, we could move to the closing of this webinar. And I'd like to thank all our presenters for sharing their knowledge and information with us. Chapter 6 provides a good overview, and it has some useful diagrams and tables that can help enhance your understanding of the key terms, indicators, and methodologies that can be used. And the CDM methodologies and tools provide you with specific details of what is required to set up mitigation projects for this sector. So we hope that this information in Chapter 6 and the CDM methodologies and tools, and together with the tools and training materials prepared by the CGE, can provide you with the key information that you need when assessing mitigation options for this sector specific to your national circumstance. And we are available to help you where you may need some help. Our next webinar will be coming in early 2019, also on this greenhouse gas compendium. And we also have a short survey that we would like you to complete. This will be sent to you in the email that will be sent to you after this webinar. The presentation and the links will be also emailed to you, shared with you. We have one question, and first question is, what are the reasons why freight has been less represented in CDM methodologies compared to passenger transport methodologies? I would like to ask Mr. Gaj Hegde to respond.
Yeah, I think transport methodologies and transport projects were somewhat late entrants to CDM. And also the methodologies we have some restrictions, like they limit to the same type of cargo or the same cargo between project and baseline, which is somewhat of a restriction. It was done to keep the methodology simple, because it was a beginning was being made with this methodology AM90 and the 110. And yeah, if there is an interest to include additional materials, it would be possible through a revision. But since these restrictions, as well as the amount of emission reductions which would come out of as was shown by my colleague, the amount of reductions is quite limited in that sense. These projects were somewhat of late entrants, not at the peak of the CDM and when the prices were low. But nevertheless, I think the potential is huge, and as we have seen in some cases where when there are some example projects, the others come up very fast. So it doesn't mean that in the future mechanisms there will be less projects of this kind.
Okay, so thank you, Gaj, for sharing that information with us. So I would like to now close this webinar and thank all the audience for their time and to attend this webinar. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar early next year. So thank you once again, and goodbye.